Are going to talk about the feudal system today. So we began a little bit last time as we divided up and conquered certain territories, and some of you did not care for the way that turned out, but if you're the two ladies left standing at the top, you seem to do pretty well for yourselves. So we're going to begin talking about how the feudal system developed today and how it operated, kind of how it worked. I know we typically wonder, so how did we go from this great society that we had in the Roman Empire to the point at which we are here in the Middle Ages, that we end up getting to castles and lots of war and lots of fighting that goes on. And so we've talked a little bit about the invaders that came in, took a lot of the wealth away, the government collapsed, and it left people to fend for themselves. And that's where we are now, where we have a group of people who were part of the nobility or the upper class, and they began to replace some of the weak kings that had been set up in parts of Western Europe. And so these nobles began to offer protection to the people in exchange for certain services. So if we had Emily over here who ended up having a pretty large estate, she could offer protection to all of the people over here on this side of the room in exchange for something. And she is going to set the terms for that something based off of what your talents and abilities may be. So, since there are two guys on this side of the room over here, there's a good possibility that she would say, I will offer protection for you as long as you serve in my military and you become one of my knights. And so these guys are going to become knights in shining armor. Right.
Which that means the girls got to work.
I don't think I would feel safe, but we can run it down.
Regardless of your personal opinion of these knights and how they're going to protect the castle, that may be one of the skills that they offer. And so the way of life here began to focus on ownership and use of land. Those that had the land had the power. And people began to just jump into this as a way of life because they had no other alternative, no other place to go, that you couldn't just hop on a plane and fly off to another continent or new country. America did not exist yet, so there was no land of opportunity. And you just were stuck in whatever situation you were born into. And you found yourself servant to whoever was more important or more wealthy than what you were. And so it all focused on the nobility, their land that they had, and that became the center of power during the feudalistic societies. So within these lands, we had a number of group of people that you need to be familiar with. The first one are the lords. These are the people that own the castle. They're the people that own the land. And they are the ones who rent out their land in exchange for services. So as Emily went around picking up pieces of land and accumulating them under her possession, the rest of you were all left with nothing to your name. And you have nowhere to earn money, no way to have an income, no way to sustain yourself other than to go back to Emily and say, okay, Emily, I realize you're bigger, more powerful than me, and you're more wealthy. So will you help me be able to survive? And Emily says, sure, I'll help you survive. And so she is talking with Haley over here, and they come to an agreement where Emily says, Haley, I'm going to give you this piece of land, and she decides how big it's going to be, but she gives Haley whatever they can come to a mutual agreement on. And in exchange for Haley being able to use that land, she can live on that land. She can now farm that land. Haley is going to raise produce. She's going to grow donuts. And as she grows donuts, oh wait, no, those don't grow on trees, do they?
Wheat.
You know,
She can make donuts.
so she is going to grow her crops. And then once harvest time comes, she is going to take 50% of those crops and she is going to give it to Emily.
Only 50 Gavin. That seems kind
Well, I'm just using that as an example.
How do
All right.
you know they're not lying?
Example. Okay. Now, because Emily owns that land, so she knows how much land she gave you, she is going to have her knights come around, and she might even come around herself and check out the land to see what you've planted and how the crop is coming. And she knows how much you are producing, and so she's going to let you keep some of it, and then she's going to keep the rest of it. You're right, 50% may have been a little bit high.
I was thinking like 75.
Or it may not have been enough. She might have required more than 50%, but I just picked that as a nice even number. So you are working. Imagine it for a moment. How many of you have jobs right now? Or had a job over the summer?
Yeah, lazy.
Okay, so if you had a job over the summer, you have one now. Imagine that you have to take 50% of your post-tax earnings. So throw the government tax out of this. You make $100, $50 has to go to your parents.
Ew.
No, I worked that.
I
What if they're
would.
dead?
So,
Well, they do provide room and board, it's kind of the same.
so yeah.
Yeah, but we're kids. They have to.
Yeah,
provide
they can't just throw us out on the street.
Hey,
It's
whoa,
illegal.
hey,
So-
Not technically.
This is imaginary. This is
I'd
serving
be
as an
scared.
example.
I'd be so ticked off.
triggers me.
This is
So,
different.
just a minute. So you come home, you got $100 in your paycheck. You have to give mom and dad 50% of that,
Sounds like my picture.
and in exchange, your parents are giving you room and board, shelter, in some cases maybe clothing, whatever it is the agreement you have. Now, if you stop paying that and you violate the agreement, then they may throw you out on the street. Now, hopefully none of your parents are actually going to do that. But that's the way it works out with Emily and Haley over here, is that if Haley does not meet her end of the agreement, then she loses her land. She loses favor with Emily, and Emily says, I'm taking that land back. You now have nowhere to live. You have nowhere to farm. You have no way to make a living. So now your only option is to become a slave.
Please don't make me.
Now, this was the motivation for the people to do what the Lord of the Manor said and to come up with a good agreement that they could fulfill. So we not only have the Lord of the land, but we also have a fief. And this here is a land grant that is given out. Okay, so the fief would be that piece of land given to Haley to be able to farm, live off of, and to help her family make a living. Okay, that's given by Emily. We also have a group of people called vassals. They're not going to show up on the screen. I thought they were, but they're not going to. So let me spell it for you. It is it is spelled V-A-S-S-A-L. V-A-S-S-A-L. So a vassal is Haley. Okay, she is the renter of that land. She does not own the land, but she works the land for Emily. She's allowed to live on it. She's allowed to work it. She's allowed to farm it, but she has to give a portion of what she does back to the Lord of the land. Because she does not have ownership, what happens when Haley dies?
There it goes back to the Lord.
Goes back to Emily. Yes, exactly. So Emily still maintains possession throughout this entire exchange. So we have the Lord, we have the fief is the land, and then we have the vassal who is the renter on that. Justin?
The land itself.
It's the land given out, yes. Yep. Haley?
What if the vassals like had a family and the person that received the fee had died? Would it then go to the family, or would they have to give it back and make a new agreement?
Yeah, you'd have to come up with a new agreement then.
What if Emily?
What if Emily dies?
Wouldn't it be like the next thing?
Yes, it would go to her next of kin. Whoever was her closest relative would then take that over. So, if Libby up here is the closest relative to Emily, and Libby's left outside the castle, doesn't get a whole lot, you think she might be motivated to assist Emily on her path to eternity?
She would be, but she can't get a check on reality.
Let's keep the conversation in world history.
Okay.
Okay, so there was a lot of fighting within the family. So Emily would do everything that she could to do one of two things. Either she would bring Libby into the castle and make her feel like she is one of the nobility and make her feel welcome and just deck her out with all kinds of expensive jewelry and garments and all kinds of stuff, make her happy. Or she would perhaps try to do away with any other threat to her castle. And so different people chose different routes on that. Victoria?
What if the person is married? Would their husband fill in then if they died or whatever?
It depends on the agreement, but yes, usually it would. Yeah. Now, I can't remember if this is going to show up on. Did women have what?
Did they even own land?
Not usually, but sometimes they would allow for them to continue to work that land, or they'd make some other provision for them. Depended on who the lord of the land was and what their view was on all that. There's one other term here that's not going to show up on the screen. It's called sub-infeudation. I will spell that once again for you, so it's not going to show up on the screen. It is spelled SUBINFEUDATION. Sub-in-feud, like family feud, Asian.
We should play like a Family Feud game on here and like categories.
That'd be awesome.
So fun.
I'll have to think of a way to do that.
Are we like,
Sub-infeudation. So sometimes the vassal, which is Haley in this case, she might have so much land that she wants to split up among some other people below her. So, not necessarily slaves, no. But let's just use Julie and Victoria as an example here, since you're close by Haley. Haley has been working the land, and she's actually gained the trust of Emily. Emily's given her a little bit more land to her fief, and now her land is too big for just... Oh, that did not sound good.
That sounded like Mr. John is pushing over his students again.
So,
You would know, Gavin.
Dang it, I'm gonna get a bad deal.
Haley has more land than what she can actually take care of. So she's going to pull in Victoria and Julie, who have been looking for somebody to partner with, but they're not really in good favor with Emily over here, and they're not able to get their own piece of land. So they come to Haley, and Haley says, hey, I got more land than I can deal with. How about I rent it out to you? And so she divides up her land into 2 equal parts.
Do I have to give Emily more money?
Hold on, we'll get to that in a minute. So, in my earlier scenario, you had to give her 50%, right?
Yeah, do I have to give
So, what's going to happen here, you're going to divide this up in between these 2 ladies. They're going to work the land for you. And they're going to have to give you 75% of everything they do. So, you keep 25. Well, no, we're going to have to go higher than that, aren't we?
90.
Yeah, 90%. They're going to have to give you 90%. So they're going to keep 10%, 10%. So that's 20% of everything is gone. You still have 80% of what you were normally doing. You have to give her 50%. You get to keep 30 for yourself. Now, you're not doing any work. You're just sitting there dividing out the land. So
Wait, so you become a lower level.
she's like a lower level nobility here.
Hey! And Emily's not doing
Dude, you gotta get good at it with the Lord, and you get like a large amount of land, you can do that.
So Emily's still getting her 50%. You figured you can live off of 30%, and each of these ladies, they had nothing before, so they're willing to work for 10% to make up that total 100% there.
Oh, shoot.
Okay? So these ladies here, they're on the low end of the feudalistic society. They are like working for barely anything, but they are working a lot to produce this.
So then they have kids, and then they make the kids do it for them, so that, hey.
Well, it was a family event. Everybody worked together. This is called sub-infeudation. So, have you ever heard of somebody subleasing an apartment?
Yeah.
It's the same idea, where you have signed agreement with the landowner, but for whatever reason you can't fulfill that lease, and so you rent it out to a friend to help you pay that lease off to the landowner. All right, so Haley's done the same thing. Now, sometimes if the situation was right, it could be subdivided again. So these ladies might be able to go find 2 or 3 people to do their work for them, and therefore they could make more money by doing less work and doing less work.
That's why America's so lazy.
This has nothing to do with America. This is all Europe. So this was sub-infeudation, part of the feudal system that helped make Europe kind of what it became in the feudalistic society. So when we look at the nobility, and we are talking here life in the castle when we're dealing with nobility, a few things that would be common here is to have one castle. In some cases, you might have a couple of them on the lord's land. This is where the lord would live. It was their main home. It also served as the jail, treasury, armory, the government, and many things happened here. Depending upon the wealth of the nobility, the castle may be rather large, or it also could be rather small. But everything happened in that castle that was of importance for that piece of land. Now, typically castles were pretty cold, damp, dusty, bleak, not very pleasant to live in. So in order to kind of brighten that up, what type of things would they do to it, or would they want to bring in?
Art.
Okay, they might bring in, maybe have a party once in a while. Art was hard to come by.
Really?
Yeah, because how are we going to pay the artists? Yeah, well, if they're working the land as hard as these ladies are working the land, they're not going to have a whole lot of time for creativity of art. So art would have been really hard to come by. Now, not that it didn't exist completely, but for the most part, art was a non-factor here. So what else might you do to warm it up and make it more comfortable?
Fire.
Yeah,
Nice
maybe.
furniture.
Okay, you said tapestries. So where are we going to get those?
Artist.
Yeah, with what material?
Him.
Tapestry was made of
Whoa.
Okay, you're going to have some wool, a little bit of cotton. What was the really nice stuff?
Silk.
Where we get that?
China.
Yes.
Silk Road.
Okay.
Dude.
Silk Road, you're right. So the really wealthy wanted to have nicer stuff than anybody else and to make the castle more pleasant. And so this is part of the reason why Marco Polo's journey was so important, was because as he brought that back, the ladies of the castle said, ooh, that's really nice. It would make my castle a much better place. I might get my own show on HGTV. And so they send out some of their people to continue to explore and to bring back more of that silk, which eventually opens up more trade between Europe and Asia, and eventually going to pull them out of the Dark Ages. So the castles themselves actually helped pull people out of the Dark Ages and begin to expand their horizons outside of Europe. Obviously, it was built as a defense mechanism as well. So anytime there was an attack on the land, all of the vassals would come running to the castle, and they would all be protected in Emily's barricade
They
there.
just make a really big castle around all the different little land things.
Like Trump does, you know.
Well, how are you going to build that many castles? Who's going to build it?
I
Like
don't
one that
know,
Trump.
but the Chinese did it with their wall.
Yes.
That took like
Chinese
forever.
That was-
and
I
it's
have no
literally,
idea how
Yeah.
long
it's
it took.
literally called the longest grave in the world
Yeah.
because so many people died making it.
Yeah, it was pretty intense. Not real practical for Europe to be able to do that. So they built these fortresses, all right, and the fortress served its purpose. Everybody ran to it when they were being attacked and would be able to defend themselves in there. Now, if we were going to go through the process of knighthood,
Apprenticeship.
that's part of it. You begin at the age of 7. So this sounds very familiar. Well, we did not talk about Sparta, but Sparta sent their boys away for military training at the age of 7 as well.
That would be awful. Like, please, let them have their childhood. Come on now.
Who wants a child?
They did get 7 years of it, Becca, they're fine.
No.
I'm sorry, but my childhood did not end at 7 years old.
Rebecca, you're like
Okay.
15, 16.
I get what you're saying. I hear you. But you have to understand that life was way, way different. So if we did not start, I say we, but if they did not start training those children at the age of 7, there's no way by the time that they became adults that they would be ready for military training, ready to go out and to fight and defend the land. And understand that the life expectancy was only about 30. during this time, maybe 35 at the most. So what we consider a childhood up through the age of 12, 13 today, Ages-7, like somebody said, would have been a pretty full childhood. By the time they get to 7 or 8, they are expected to start turning into young adults. We have kind of transformed that in society today. So they begin at the age of 7, they send them off, and they begin their training. Now, it was not quite as strict and difficult as the Spartan training. That was during the Greek Empire, which we jumped in right after the Greeks had fallen. But the Spartans were some of the most fierce fighters of all of Greece. What you see on the movies somewhat depicts it, but there's a lot more to it than what you see in Hollywood. So, the age of 7, you go off and you start training. You begin as a page. And during this part of the training, you learn how to do simple things like hunting. You learn certain academics. You learn how to sword fight and to fence. Like fencing like the sword fight, not like building fences. So you go out there and you learn certain weapons skills as a page. Then you are going to become a squire during your teenage years. You graduate to this by completing your page training. And during your time as a squire, you are a personal servant to a knight. And it works like an apprenticeship where you are assigned to an experienced knight. You are going to do everything he tells you to do, even if it seems like a ridiculous task. And you are going to learn from him, and you're going to observe him, and essentially be his slave until you can graduate and become a knight around the age of 21. Now, you had to have the personal recommendation of that knight in order to go to the knight stage yourself. So he may have asked you to do all kinds of crazy stuff, and if you refused, you might lose that recommendation. So a lot of it did depend on who you ended up getting partnered with as far as your experience, whether it was positive or not. And so once you get to the age of 21, what'd you say?
How would they partner them? Just like randomly, Bill Bob, you go with this person?
That's my assumption. I don't know. Yeah. Now, these knights were expected to abide by a code of chivalry.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Why have we never heard of
Definitely
it?
dead. Chivalry's not dead yet.
It is definitely dead.
Now,
Not yet.
what we often think of in our modern terms with chivalry is perhaps quite different from what the chivalry code was for these.
Wasn't it like fighting
These guys.
someone?
True.
Like a girl or something?
Okay, this
Yeah.
kind of chivalry is dead, but not
What-
like.
What we may think of as chivalry today is generally proper and decent manners of a gentleman toward a lady.
No.
Now,
I will teach
so when we are talking about knights here, it is a strict code of behavior. And there were certain things that these knights were expected to do, and they were supposed to follow this code. It was not necessarily a written code, but a code of honor. And a lot of that did have to do with the way they treated women. And they were expected to treat women with utmost respect. This is one thing that I am working diligently with my boys on teaching them how to properly address their sister, their mom. We just had a conversation yesterday. We were at the dinner table, and there were certain things that my boys were doing that were not appropriate for the dinner table, and so we were discussing that, and so just I will just throw this out there that for you guys, when you start being interested in trying to pursue a lady, to think about the way that you are going about that. And it's very difficult to find a lady that will pursue a guy who does not have proper manners and who does not treat them well. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but if you want a quality young lady then you need to treat her better than you would want to be treated. So just a little word of wisdom there for you guys. Make sure that you are treating the girls well, and not just the girl you're interested in. I've seen that a lot where guys will treat that girl he has a crush on really nice and treat her friends or other girls in the class like garbage.
But then, like,
And that,
but then, like, then they don't
and
know that. So then it's like, oh,
so,
you treat
no,
somebody
hey, wait, okay.
You get a sentence out with these girls.
Right now, you should not be. We should not be talking about it anyway. All right, I'm giving you. I'm giving you advice. I'm not opening up for discussion. So, I'm just offering advice. It's up to you whether you want to listen or take it or not. It's up to you. But
I'm telling you, they want us respectful guys. But they interrupt us every other sentence. I'm just saying. Makes us definitely want to respect.
Well, okay. I'm not gonna. One last thing. So, I understand what you're saying, but regardless of how you're treated, you still need to understand how your response could affect the way that you're viewed by somebody else. So, even if you're totally justified and absolutely 100% right, the way that you reply and respond can be taken in a wrong way. So somebody mentioned, I think it was Haley mentioned, watch how the guy treats his mom. It's also important, guys, to watch how the girl treats her dad, because I think that's important. And for my wife and I, we started dating in high school. I was a junior, she was a senior, and her dad was the pastor of our church. And so we had a lot of very strict rules on our dating relationship, rightly so, and I believe it was important we did, and I'm thankful now that we did. Not always at the moment, but for that reason, we spent a lot of time with her family, around the dinner table, watching movies, that type of thing. Her parents were always there. We rarely, if ever, had a date by ourselves, and if it was by ourselves, it was like her parents or my parents dropped us off at the mini golf course and picked us up an hour later, and some of our friends were on another hole, like still at the same location. We were never in a place by ourselves. So I remember on many occasions just watching her and her dad interact and the way that they had a relationship there. And they have a very good relationship. But I also remember on some occasions where we'd be watching a movie together. He'd get up, leave the room, go get something to drink, come back, and instead of sitting in his normal chair over here, he'd come and he'd wedge himself between the two of us, just sit down in the middle. And so, I took a lot of notes for how.
Mr. Jones is gonna do that to his kids.
Oh, that is happening for sure. So anyway.
Have you seen the movie Super by the Dozen?
Yep.
They go to the movie theater.
Yeah. So, yeah.
My dad should have told me at one point that if any guy
Yeah.
asked me to movies, the answer would be no.
So a couple of other things here with chivalry. When it applies to the knights here, they were supposed to be very brave in battle, skilled with their weapons, honest and generous was a big part of that as well. They were expected to be loyal to the Lord, and it would be a small lowercase l if my font allowed for lowercase.
Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
What was that, Aaron?
And then they also participate in tournaments. Yeah, those tournaments were meant to help them work on their skills. They had two different types of tournaments that they would typically participate in, one of which was the joust, and then the other was the melee. And so the joust, I'm going to show you a video here in just a moment on what the joust was like, but your goal there was to knock the other guy off his horse. Any of you ever been to medieval times? Okay, medieval times, give us a been to the place called Medieval Times. There's a restaurant. Yeah, it's in a lot of major cities, they have a medieval times. I don't know if there's one around here, but it's a pretty cool environment where they have you sit around an amphitheater style restaurant, and there's no utensils. They bring out like this Cornish hen, very medieval type food, and you eat with your fingers. And then in the center of the arena, you're sitting there, you're watching all this happen. They have these jousts and competitions and night challenges for the guys that are dressed up like knights. It's pretty cool. The melee. Melee is a tournament style with a team competition. So you would have a number of different events that you participated in order to win the melee. And so different manners would compete against each other to see who had the best knights. And it was a way for them to work on their skills there. What do they do if they both fall off?
There's always some sort of a difference. And I mean,